Hello, hello, and welcome to episode number 15 of Glad You Asked. Can't believe we made it this far. I'm John Lopez, one of your hosts. I'm a sports photographer based in New York
You keep
City.
going to sports photographer. You're a coach, right? Middle school girls.
Yes,
What's going on with that?
Indeed. I was proud of them, man. I coached girls for the first time starting last year. This is my second season, and I really, really enjoyed it, man. It was a great challenge, a lot of fun. It's so fun. I mean, just coaching young people in general and just watching the 7th and 8th graders and, kind of watching the development from the beginning of the season to the end. At the beginning, our team could barely make layups. We're kicking the ball out of bounds. By the end of the season, we're running drills. We're going up and down the court. We're executing plays.
Intimidating teams in the layup line.
That's right. That's half the battle, right?
They were scared to come out and guard.
If you look good on the layup line, then woof.
Nice. I'm Jeff Henderson, footwear designer.
Extraordinaire. Don't you have a young child who once told you, no, Dad, I will not do the tap water. I would like the sparkling.
We live a good life here. We live a good life here. It's not always about the flat water. Sometimes bottled water has to be sparkling. Now, if your tap water is sparkling, you might not want to partake because every now and again, our apartment, they got to shut off the water because the water is sparkling, and that's not actually supposed to happen. If we live in a sedity enough house to where our tap water is sparkling, then we live in a good life. But I don't think it was actually.
I think I saw Chavi drinking his bubbly out of a champagne glass once.
Is he supposed to use a paper cup? Come on now, John. What are you talking about? All right. What are we going to be discussing today, John?
Today I'm going to break down curves.
Curves? What's a curve?
Curves is a great way to manipulate an image.
No, John. I said, what's a curve, John? I'm setting you up. Softball.
Got you.
What's a curve, John?
A curve is when you call me and invite me to dinner and I tell you, about that, I have...
You were supposed to say, glad you asked. What is this, episode number 15? John, what's a curve?
Well, Jeff, I'm glad you asked.
See, there we go.
Thank you for bringing up that timely question. I was wondering why the producers in the back were like, hello, waving their arms in the air.
Wondering why this episode is 38 minutes and 22 seconds.
We're going to clean this up. Jeff, I'm glad you asked what a curve is. A curve is in many things. It could be when you tell someone you're somewhere that you're really not because you don't want to hang out with them, which is what our good Portland friend Will did to me this weekend. Will was in New York City. He curved me. He owes me about $35, so I understand.
Oh, it's tough life.
No, anyway, so curves as they pertain to Photoshop and image editing, you'll see them popping up in actually a lot of apps. We talked about in the past, talking about Snapseed. Snapseed recently did an update to their software where they actually have curves in them. So curves come from Photoshop as far as I know. That's where I'm most familiar with them, but you can see them in programs like Lightroom, Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. You can see them in Capture One. You can see them pretty much in any photo editor you're using. And as I said, they're even popping up on apps for your phone. So today we're going to go over it. Here's a photo of Andres Nocioni from Argentina's national team down in the Rio Olympics.
Again, John Lopez, Olympic photographer.
There's a few ways to access the curves, okay? First off, we can go into our image menu, scroll down to adjustments, and then tap on curves. You'll see here that the shortcut for that is Command M. And if I click on that, it'll pop up this handy window. And a lot of people see this and they get super intimidated. Like, what? I'm looking at a chart here. This is like super Jeff engineering stuff. And I felt that same way. I felt that way. I was like, I don't ever want to touch a curve ever. And so I'm going to hit cancel and get out of here. No, actually, we're going to redo that. But as you've heard from me in the past, I like to do my editing in a non-destructive way so that if I change my mind, I can always go back. So if you hit Command M and get that same window we were just in, and I make any changes here, these are going to be permanent. So you'll see here, if I go like this, I'll make the image really bright or really dark. And I'll say OK on this just for the sake of argument. That's not pretty. But I'm going to undo that by pressing Command Z. You'll notice here, there's no way to undo this. If I do another step in my editing, I will have destroyed the actual image. I don't want to do that. So I'm going to press Command Z, and I'm going to show you the non-destructive way to access your curves. And that's simply down here under the adjustment layers. So if I create a new filler adjustment layer, I'm going to tap this icon, and there's a curves option here. So now the big difference is, now that I did that, I now have a new layer that popped up here, and it says curves on it, and it has a mask already built in. We talked about masks, right? So it's all white. So that means anything I do to this layer is going to affect my entire image. I could later go in and change that up, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in the episode. So my curve pops up down here in my properties panel. If you open up Photoshop in a default way, all of these panels are actually going to be on the right-hand side. I just moved them to the left because that's just the way I like to work, from left to right. So don't be fooled. This is...
Configure yours how you need to.
Exactly. Be comfortable with your workspace.
So
now when we're on the RGB, first of all, we'll work our way top down. There are some presets here. Actually, I'm lying. I never use these presets, but you totally can.
They were there till this episode.
I never use the presets. Feel free to go in and play. I strongly recommend always playing around in Photoshop. And you see, automatic. That's actually not bad. I'll press Command Z to undo that though. But I like to get my hands dirty and just actually play around in here. So the first thing we'll see is these different channels. And the RGB channel affects the brightness of the image. And in fact, as these are all set up, they all affect the brightness and the saturation of your image. So you want to be careful with that. And I'll talk to you more about that in just a moment. So I can also affect only the red channel, only the green channel, or only the blue channel. And those obviously affect those colors and their opposites. So the opposite of red is going to be a green color. The opposite of green here is going to be a magenta color. And the opposite of blue is yellow. These are the colors on the color wheel, just so you kind of get it. That'll make sense for you in a moment when we get into the color editing of this.
There's primary education here. I like this.
So I'm going to start off in the RGB curve, and I'm going to affect the lightness. What I want to do with this, I actually kind of like the brightness of this image already, but what I want to do is I want to go ahead and create a vignette. And there's many ways to create a vignette. I'm going to do it using curves and a mask, just to kind of show you
what's
that.
a vignette?
Well, Jeff, I'm
glad
glad you
asked.
asked.
When I go to the fancy bagel shop?
This is what Chavi might order.
With the sparkling water? I have the sparkling water with my vignette, please.
Now, a vignette is kind of just the way we handle the edges of the frame. And again, I'm using my hands to talk as if you can see them. But a vignette, typically you see them where we darken the edges, and so we focus on the center of the frame. Or maybe some other area of the frame. And actually... if we use a typical vignette, like a standard vignette, it will automatically darken only the edges. But right now, since we're going to do it via curves, we can actually darken any part of the image we want and brighten any part of the image we want. And you'll see that right now. Sometimes it doesn't have to be darker either. Vignettes sometimes can actually brighten the edges, which gives you a different effect, but it also draws your attention into the center or towards your subject, hopefully. In this case, we're going to darken the edges, and we're going to make our own custom vignette using curves. So I'm going to just drag this down from the center. Actually, I'm going to talk to you about curves. Let me just kind of break down these quadrants. So this upper right-hand quadrant here, with these 4 boxes in it, this is where the highlights reside of your image. So you can see there's not a lot of information up there. And in the image, you can tell that the highlights are really in the uniform. But most of this image, if you look at it, is all much darker, which is down here. So your darks are down here in the lower left quadrant. So if I move this up, you'll see I'll make the image much brighter in a weird way. And if I move it to the right, I'm going to make it much darker. And that's just kind of the way that's working. So if I bring these things up to here, upper left, I'm making it much brighter. Lower right, making it much darker.
That's what my shots look like.
So I'll just drag off of the screen to kind of undo that curve there. And what I want to do is I'm going to darken the entire image. So I'm going to start from the middle, darken it, darken it, darken it. Now, I don't really like what's happening to my subject here. He's faded out. But as I pointed out, because we're doing this non-destructively and using an adjustment layer, we actually have this mask built in here. So I'm going to press B to access my brush tool. And I'm going to change it up. I just want a standard brush here. The size is fine. Hardness, I want it to be set to 0. That's going to give me a nice feathered edge. I'll show you the difference. If I put the hardness up to 100 and I click in here, I'll press my right bracket key. I'm just going to click away for a second. Press my right bracket key to make my brush bigger. I changed the hardness to 100%. Look what happens. When I click once, I have a hard edge there. You can see like the edges, Jeff is having a hard time seeing because of the glare.
I'm good.
But if you see there's a really hard edge, and that's not going to be good. So if I paint here, we have a really hard edge.
Got a tan, farmer's tan.
Exactly. We don't want that in our image. So I'm going to press Command Option Z, or that's Control Alt Z to step back a few places. And I'm going to change. There's another way to change it. So I could go back up here, And I can change the hardness by clicking here, or I can hold on a Mac. It's Function and Control. I'm gonna be honest, I don't know what that is on a PC. It's actually Control and Alt on a Mac. So if I click and drag up, I'm changing the hardness, and if I click and drag left and right, I can also change the size on my brush. Very convenient.
If I use Photoshop, I might use that.
There you go. All right, so let's just make sure I have this where I want, 0% hardness, and then I'll make it a little bit bigger. So now I'm going to paint. You can see my foreground color is black. My mask is white. So now I'm going to use black to get rid of the effect of my curves layer. So I'm going to do that, and now because I'm using a soft edge brush, I can just kind of tap around my subject here and get only the part of the image that I want to be brighter. So now I'll turn that off and on so you can see the difference. So now we just really darken the edges of this image and focus our attention only on our subject.
Unreal.
So this is a great way to kind of draw your viewers' attention to a specific area of the image that you want to be highlighted. So another thing we could do with this, because it's an adjustment layer and it's on its own separate layer, we can also affect its blend modes. So remember I told you that using these layers affects the saturation. I don't really want this darkening to affect the saturation of my image. So to correct that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to change the blending mode of this layer. I'm selected on a Curves 1 layer here. I'm going to go into the blending modes, and I'm going to change the blending mode to luminosity. So that way...
Are those the people who from behind the scenes decide what happens in the real world?
Yes.
Like Tupac was killed by the luminosity?
The luminosity is where Jeff and Will are the presidents. And one thing. No. I said luminosity, not Illuminati.
Got it. Tupac was not killed by the luminosity. Got you.
So luminosity, as the word might suggest to some people, if you're a walking dictionary, it affects the lightness and brightness of the image. Specifically, it does not affect the color. So when I click on this, it'll be a subtle change, but you can kind of notice that the red here changed just a touch. I'll undo that. If you look at that red jersey down here in this area, you'll see that it was affecting it before. That's with the luminosity, that's without. So it's just affecting that. And I want to make sure that I'm not affecting my colors in this instance. So that's what I do with that. Now I'm going to create a new curves adjustment layer, just by going into my adjustment layers, and I'll click on curves again, and now we have a blank slate to work with a new mask. It's curves 2. This time I do want to affect the colors. So now I'm going to kind of color treat my image only using curves. Now curves are so amazing because as you can see, we just added contrast by creating that vignette. We can also, well actually, you know what? I'll show you right now. So to add contrast specifically, we might brighten up the brights and darken down the darks, like so. That just added an immense amount of contrast. And I'll do the before and after, so you can kind of see what's happening. That really has a major impact on our image. So that's another great thing curves can do. And I'll add yet another one. Now, normally you could do multiple things on one, but because I'm affecting the blend modes, so for example, this one here, I want to make this luminosity as well. I don't want it to affect the colors. And you'll see when I click that, there'll be a subtle change. You can see what was happening to the blues there. They were getting really saturated, and I didn't really want that. So to show you before and after, look at the blues on his jersey. You can kind of see what was going on there. And this is before that and with it. Now we'll add another one. I like to separate them for the colors because now I intentionally am going to color correct this image. And actually, I think the color is correct as far as a photojournalist would be concerned to kind of share this image. This is correct, totally fine and acceptable without dramatically changing what was actually right in front of my eyes.
What would be an example of someone needing color correction?
I'm glad you asked. It's not necessarily someone. It's an image. So sometimes in arenas, especially if you're shooting in a high school gym or a college arena sometimes, the lights are not ideal. So the lights could be fluorescent lights and there'll be like this extra yellow hue that's in the gym and all your images are coming out yellow and you don't really know why. Part of that is because you didn't adjust your white balance accordingly or because the lights are just so dramatic. It's like from one image to the next, they're just really different. And so in those cases, you want to correct the colors. So in this case, I'm not necessarily correcting these colors because they are correct. In Rio, obviously there's, the lights were spectacular. I've never photographed an indoor arena as beautifully lit as I did in the Rio Olympics. So
shout out to lighting in Rio.
Word. Please come to New York and light up every gym that way. Please. We need you. So anyhow, back to this. So now I'm not gonna color correct this, but I'm going to color treat this. And this is a way that you can kind of affect the colors in your image using curves. So for example, let's say we wanted this to be really red. So I can kind of add red into the highlights up there if I just move my curve up top. And you see it's affecting the whole image, but I can make another point here, drag this down. So now I'm only affecting the highlights. So you see I can add green because green is the opposite of red. Or I can add more red to go there. That's just one way to do it. I could add more green to the image here. And that kind of gives it like a cool tone. And when I say cool, I mean like getting bluish, actually, even though blue is not the opposite of red, but it's just looking blue because of the nature of this particular image. So that's not bad, and we can see a before and after here. Changes it, gives it a little cinematic look. You know what? I think I might keep that. We can go into greens and do the same thing. I could kind of move from the edge here. I could reduce some of the green, making it more magenta. You can see it's looking pinkish. Or I could add more green, making it more green. And that's actually not so bad. It looks kind of like we're in an episode of Breaking Bad.
I was going to say, it looks kind of sick. It looks kind of sick.
But we're not done. So we can come down to the blue channel. And now blue, again, the opposite of blue is yellow. So if I move this to the left, I'm adding blue. Right? If I bring it down, I'm adding yellow. This is actually an example. This is what an image might look like in a really awfully lit high school gym somewhere.
Or 1972.
Yeah. Either way.
Kind of has that little...
You can borrow Marty McFly's whip to get this, or you can kind of adjust your white balance. So here we can kind of make the image even cooler by bringing the blues up. And that's actually interesting, right? So now their team happens to have a blue color. So if you add all this blue into it, now you can kind of put a little logo here or something and kind of represent them, and it kind of all flows together a little bit more naturally. So this is obviously not necessarily pretty in how I would necessarily edit this image for professional work. However, for creative work, this might be right in line with something else that I'm trying to add in.
Interesting. Because usually somebody would just go and put a blue filter over the whole thing and make it blue and with a hammer, as opposed to going and fine tuning each different color.
Exactly. I learned that from Obama, actually, right? Obama, said, previous president might be coming in with a sledgehammer when he really needed a scalpel. And curves are kind of the scalpel in this kind of example. So
people are going to be Googling curves and coming up with something different. So hopefully they get to our instructional video and not other curves.
You know what? I'm glad you said that because these are the RGB curves. That's what this is, right? Red, green, blue. That's what it really is. So as you can tell, these are what the channels are. So that's why it's called RGB here. And you got red, green, and blue. So these are technically the RGB curves. I refer to it specifically as curves because that is what I'm accustomed to.
He likes curves. John Lopez likes curves, just so we're clear with that.
So now if I hold Option or Alt on a Windows and I click on this eyeball here, it's going to only show me the layer that I'm choosing, and it's going to hide all the other layers. So this is going to give us a before and an after. So I'll click on that. This is what the image looked like when we first brought it in straight out the camera. This is after we added a bunch of different curves layers. So we'll bring them on one at a time. The first thing we did, we added a vignette and we made our subject stand out by nature of just adjusting the lighting in the image. Right? And in fact, what I'll do now, I think this is too strong. I kind of like seeing that someone's shooting a free throw. So I could actually reduce it by bringing this up, right? But I kind of like the way that it's dark, right? So what else can I do with this? Well, I'm glad you asked. What I can do now is affect the opacity of just this layer. That's another benefit of keeping this on its own layer. So now I can actually reduce the opacity of this layer so that it's not too dark. So that really, we're talking about sledgehammers versus scalpels. That really just changed things. So I can undo that, go to 100%. 54%, 100%, 54%. And then if I turn it off, you can tell there's still a dramatic effect going on here, but it's just not as dramatic as it was when it was at 100%. The next thing we did, we added more contrast. So we thought to enhance this image even more, let's add more contrast. So boom, we did this. Same thing now. I think this is a little bit too drastic. So I'm going to click on this layer. It's curves 2. And I see the opacity at 100%. I'm going to drag that down just a touch. And I'm doing this is subjective. There's no rhyme or reason to this. I'm just looking at it. I'm just giving it the eyeball test here. So I'll bring it down to about 46%. And let's see before, after, before, after. I kind of like that, right? It really, I think this enhances the image. And then finally, we just got a little bit creative with the colors. And these first two curves, as you remember, are on the luminosity blending mode. And that way they only affect the brightness of the image, not the saturation. Now, on the third curves layer, we did want to affect the colors. So I'll turn that on, and you see it has this whole green situation going on. It's a little bit cooler in toning. And it's all normal, and that's fine, but it's technically it's affecting the brightness and the color as well. So if we wanted this to really be only focusing on the color, we can simply come down here to this conveniently named blend mode called color.
Wow.
And when I click on this, it only affects the colors. So now that actually made a big difference, actually, if you look at it. So before, it's actually kind of subtle, but to me, this makes it a lot better. So now that it's only affecting the colors and not the contrast. So we maintain the contrast of the previous curves layer, and now we're only affecting the colors. And then because it's an adjustment layer, this is the beauty of it. I can go back in here now and I can totally tweak it to be a totally different looking image if I wanted to. So I can make it a little less green by bringing the reds back up. Right, and I go into the green channel and I can bring that down and say, I don't really like that green sick look, But then with the blue channel, maybe I say, I want it to look much more blue, and I want the highlights to look more yellow, right? And so now we have a totally different look visually in the colors from a color standpoint.
Has a little more soul, a little more character. Do you think that these tweaks and these edits, because I can clearly see if I were to have this image, the difference between where it would show up in ESPN.com or on Vice.com? Like the more gritty, the more sort of silhouetted vignette where you haven't got the vignette yet, or is that the vignette?
The first one was a vignette. Yeah.
So getting that sort of imagery where it gets a little darker feels more like, say, Vice, and the other one that's a little more saturated, a little more heavy with color, looks a little more like pure sport ESPN. Is that?
I think that's fair, and it's funny because the lines are being blurred, right? Outlets like Bleacher Report are getting really heavy with their graphic work, right? And even the NBA, they're getting more creative with their graphic work as well. But again, as a photojournalist, some of these changes are not acceptable, right? So when I'm giving these photos to the International Basketball Federation during the Olympics, for example, I need it to be lifelike, like what we saw
as
on
pure
the court.
as possible.
Exactly. So yes, I am editing. I'm adjusting things like contrast. I'll crop an image. I may add a little bit of sharpening, right? But very subtle things that are not affecting the reality of what happened before me. I'm not moving the basketball and putting it somewhere else. I'm not removing a security guard from the background somewhere. You know what I mean? I'm not taking those kind of liberties. And I'm also not getting crazy with my vignettes or my colors. My colors are color correction when I'm shooting for that type of event because this is world news. This is a historic event. And
your goal is to make it as realistic as possible.
Exactly. And so ESPN does follow that mode, but you'll see sometimes a lot of the commercials now for some of the college games, NCAA games, and the professional games, they're getting more creative with some of those things, taking more liberties with that in a creative standpoint. And I think it looks great. I think people are becoming more accustomed to this too, especially as social media grows. And, you'll see some where they'll boost like the clarity of an image. So if I come into the background and I press Shift Command A, this will allow me to get to the camera raw dialog. And we'll talk more about camera raw in a separate episode. But here, if I boost the clarity, you get this like hyper sharpened image, right?
Count the hairs on his head.
And this actually looks kind of cool. It's definitely totally stylized. I may come into the sharpening and I may bring up the sharpening even further and bring the radius down, detail way up. And, if I say okay on that, give it a second to think. I have a totally different image. I'll press Command Z to see it before and then after, before and then after. You can see what it did. It brought a lot of details in the crowd all of a sudden and his jersey.
Wrinkles in his jersey.
Yeah.
But it looks a little heavy-handed.
Exactly. And for me, this is heavy-handed. But you know what? It's still a beautiful image.
Yeah.
I wouldn't submit this necessarily as journalistic work, but as a creative piece.
It looks kind of cartoony in a cool way.
Yeah. And all I did was change a couple of dials, and there's further things we could do. We could actually go in and apply that same effect again to get to kind of really bring it out even further. And then in this case, maybe I would take the vignetting and we brought it down before. Maybe now I want it to be more dramatic, so maybe now I will make it darker on purpose, and I'll do the same with the contrast layer.
It's amazing that it's all from the same original photograph.
That's right. And so speaking of that, I'll come back here. I'll hold the Option key. And I'll just remove all the other ones. And so now what I did though, when I pressed Command Shift A to get to the camera raw settings, that was a destructive edit. So now that's embedded in here. However, if I'm shooting, this is a raw image, in fact, but I'm using a JPEG version of it. When you're shooting in RAW, which on a Canon camera is going to be a .cr2 as opposed to a .jpeg. If you're shooting Nikon, it'd be a .nef as opposed
We'll have
to
a whole episode on this because
we're starting to get a little more. We're getting beyond the scope of this episode, but hey, I'm glad you asked. You're getting more than you bargained for, right? So
no extra cost to you.
I hope I'm sharing some helpful tips, though, in all seriousness. And I love using the Camera Raw filter on JPEG images because sometimes you're shooting in JPEG by mistake or deliberately, but you still want to access some of those things. And those are things that are available to you using Photoshop Lightroom, using Capture One, and other editors. So anyway, I could have just duplicated the image and then did it on there, so I could adjust it. There's other ways to do it in a non-destructive way, so we maintain the last image, the original image within here. But now when I save this as a PSD, I could also change the file name so that way I still maintain my JPEG's originality, and then have this. But look at what we ended up with, right? We started somewhere around here, minus a little bit of clarity, and then we ended up here. All using curves and just a little bit of that Camera Raw filter at the end there.
Yeah, you get some brush to get the highlights of just the player, but that's the part that I'm actually more compelled by. Like, I think we're gonna have to do another session just on masking the way you sort of called him out. That was very nice. But for now, very cool episode, John.
Hey, much appreciated. So, Jeff, tell us, where can we get our questions answered?
If you have questions, more for John on curves, RAW versus JPEG, everything else, he's just going to type it in. So I don't have to say, email us at yo@gladyouasked.today. Again, that's yo@gladyouasked.today. Please join us for another riveting episode on whatever it is we talk about during the next episode. Who knows what it could be? My guess is you'll just scroll down and read and see what you want to see. Cool. Thank you.
Sounds good. Thanks for tuning in.
Peace.